But attachment styles are really important in trying to figure out when there's a gridlock, when there's a time where we just can't get through to each other. It might come down to how we view our relationships with other people, how we view our relationship with our parents or caregivers, and ultimately our relationships with ourselves. So a lot of those.
Hey y'all, Katie here with Mom Nation, and welcome to another episode of Our Love Story. We know being in a relationship is hard, so Diana Eisel, certified couples counselor, and I talk through different tips and tricks to help you navigate your relationship and get through everyday life. While you're here on your favorite podcast platform, please subscribe to our channel. Or if you'd like to visit us on YouTube and watch the video, our handle is Mom Nation USA. We hope you enjoy the show.
What's up, Mom Nation? We are back with our monthly talk with Diana Eisel and Q&A with a couples counselor. Our Love Story is the name of this podcast episode. We are so sorry we are a few days late. We should have been here live on Friday, but the internet gods decided not to bestow internet upon me. And therefore, poor Diana was like, well, I could do Monday. So thank you. Thank you, Diana, for being with me today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Are you a little roasty toasty over there? How you doing?
You know, I'm just counting down the days to fall. Honestly, I think I'm in the wrong state, but happy to be here. And I'm just going to count down the days until, the Halloween stores open. And I'm all about that vibe. So I'm just counting the days.
Are you a pumpkin everything girl?
Oh my gosh, I'm so basic. I'm as basic as it gets. All of the pumpkin things all the time.
Same. You can definitely bribe me with anything pumpkin. So keep that in mind, people, as we come upon pumpkin season. But today, Diana, we are not talking about pumpkins. Today, we are talking about attachment. Now, we normally, not always, but we'll normally find an anonymous post in the Mom Nation Arizona group, typically. And, oftentimes, I shouldn't even say it like that. Like, marriage is hard. And being in a relationship is hard. Having a spouse or a significant other is hard. It takes work. It's two different people coming from two different places coming together to remain in harmony. And that isn't always an easy street. And so we see a lot of posts about this. We often talk through them. I'm really, really hopeful. Of course, we only usually choose anonymous posts because we don't want to put anyone on blast. So anonymous people out there that we have talked, if we've talked about your post, I know you're anonymous, so you may not want to let us know, but I would love to know if it helped you because I assume that it did. We dive pretty deep here on this show, and I thank you for that, Diana. So today, I'm going to ask that you take it away and tell us about attachment and why that is something you wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Attachment styles, something that not everyone has really necessarily heard about or know much about, but there is this very common cliche, if you will, that when people say, oh, you're going to go to therapy and we're going to have to talk about my childhood. And it's almost like this very tongue-in-cheek joke. And a lot of times people will say, well, I'm not here for that. I'm here for my relationship where we're struggling to communicate or solve conflict or any of those things. And we do have to visit. So it's not necessarily somewhere that we have to live in the past, but we do have to visit there to try to figure out our attachment styles. So what exactly is an attachment style? So attachment is our relationship that we have with our caregivers, most frequently our parents, when we are growing up. So there's 4 insecure attachment styles. There's anxious, avoidant / dismissive, and disorganized. And then there's secure. And so we're going to go through all of those today. We're going to talk about how those attachment styles form in childhood and then what they might look like when we're adults. So again, it's not something that oftentimes we talk about, but attachment styles are really important in trying to figure out when there's a gridlock, when there's a time where we just can't get through to each other. It might come down to how we view our relationships with other people, how we view our relationship with our parents or caregivers, and ultimately our relationships with ourselves. So a lot of those attachment styles have to do with like our own self-worth and how we feel about ourselves. So the first attachment style that we'll talk about today is anxious attachment. in childhood, if there is abuse, whether it's physical or emotional abuse, or early separation from our caregivers, that can cause an anxious attachment style. So anytime that we're feeling on edge, that comes from anxiety from our caregivers because we weren't taken care of in the way that we could have. And of course, abuse is a terrible thing for any child to experience. And most frequently, that is not something that just goes away. Even with therapy and things like that as a child, it does sometimes crop up later in our relationships. And sometimes we don't know how that looks and we don't understand. So you might be asking, my spouse or myself, my partner was abused as a child. How would I even know that they have an anxious attachment style, right? So some of the things that are sort of hallmarks for anxious attachment style is one is low self-esteem. So putting others or your partner at a higher regard than yourself is something that is a part of having an anxious attachment style, and also being really sensitive to rejection, sensitive to criticism, sensitive to feedback, those sorts of things, which makes it really difficult to, have those hard conversations. Their self-worth is often something that comes up as well. I said a minute ago about having low self-esteem, but also low self-worth as a person, but also like their position and their relationship is something that's also a part of anxious attachment style. Rejection is a huge trigger for people with anxious attachment, feeling like I'm not good enough, or there's something wrong with me, or I am not favorable in some way. And then they'll blame themselves. So people with anxious attachment style, when they hear that sort of criticism or rejection, they'll blame themselves instead of being able to look at the entire situation holistically and see how, the whole system is being affected. It's not just that, and they tend to go straight for self-blame. People with anxious attachment style need constant reassurance. So they need to know, this is what it might sound like in your relationship. Is everything okay? Are you okay? Are you mad at me? Are we okay? Is everything okay? Are we still good? Like a lot of those things are super common questions for someone with anxious attachment style. It's basically like, is my position still secure in this relationship, or should I be ready to run? Should I be ready to cut and run at any time because I'm not sure like what my position is in this relationship? Obviously, this can cause a lot of problems in the relationship because they have a lot of doubt and worry about their position in the relationship. And sometimes people, the other person who perhaps doesn't have the anxious attachment style, can perceive them as clingy. And, nobody loves it when somebody is super clingy and all over them and wanting to know what they're doing. And sometimes that can border on the edge of like controlling. And so if you're having this thought that maybe my partner is being controlling, that might very well be the case. But also, do they have an anxious attachment? Are they worried about what you're doing? Are they worried that you're going to go and find someone else better than they are because they don't think very highly of themselves, right? So that can cause problems with their own self-doubt and worry. And if you are the other person, again, having to provide that consistent reassurance, because people with anxious attachment, they need it constantly. Right. They need that constant reassurance their position in their relationship is secure. And if they don't get it because the other person just isn't understanding that that's what they need, it can feel really annoying. It can feel like, obviously, everything's fine. We're in a relationship. I'll tell you if anything's fine. But to people with an anxious attachment style, they are consistently running under the premise that things could not be fine.
And I can see how that can get somewhat annoying or just like weird for the other partner. Like, what Absolutely. In the world? I have to repeat myself every day.
Yeah. I mean, we should all be giving our partners reassurance, at any given time, right? Like we all want to hear it. We all want to hear that like we're valued and we're worthy and all of those things. But people with anxious attachment style didn't get that as a child. They received abuse instead of reassurance. So they're consistently seeking that in their adult relationships.
And can we quickly define abuse? Because I think that, when some people think of that, they immediately go to physical.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, it's not just physical abuse. Physical abuse is talked about a lot, physical and sexual abuse. But then there's also the emotional abuse. Right. The emotional abuse can be berating, just being dismissive, which is more of a hallmark of avoidant, which we're going to get to next. But anything that makes someone feel less than or not important, or somehow negatively affects their own worth as a child and their position as a child, that's emotional abuse. Having to walk on eggshells around someone because if they're triggered in some way, they're going to have this big explosive reaction. That's abuse. You know, and that's to say that anytime that someone's, in a bad mood or irritated or something like that, that's not abuse. Right. Abuse is the consistent, you are inconvenient to me. And when you interrupt me or bother me in some way, I'm going to make you feel really terrible about yourself as a result. So that is emotional abuse. So physical abuse, which is pretty, self-explanatory. So is sexual abuse, but also emotional abuse falls under that as well.
And now we have one question from the audience here, and I have this same question too. And Amy's asking, does that translate into all relationships or just romantic? I kind of feel like it could be all, right?
Yes, it's typically all adult relationships, but you see it most frequently in romantic relationships. I mean, you think about couples counseling, right? Like we don't typically, and I say typically, go to therapy for, I have a really hard time with relationships in general, which might be true, but most often we see it crop up when there's some communication or conflict resolution issues within the romantic relationship. But yes, it does typically translate across other relationships as well. But our romantic relationships, our partner is our person. And as we're growing up, our parents are our caregivers. They're our people. And so we sort of equate that sort of acceptance and love to someone that we've chosen. That's our person.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So anxious attachment is the first one. And then there's avoidant or dismissive attachment style. So in childhood, that looks like parents who are very dismissive, parents who are emotionally distant, or there's some sort of expectation for kids to be more independent than they need to be as kids. So what does dismissiveness mean? Well, a really good example of that is you're fine when you're crying, right? If a child is crying and you're like, you're fine, just, that
take it off,
rub some dirt in it. You're fine. Yeah. It's not a big deal. It could be worse. Stop crying.
I had it worse as a kid.
Yep, I had it worse as a kid. You need to just suck it up. It's not a big deal. Why are you crying? Okay, that's enough. All those things that are very emotionally dismissive to any sort of emotional experience of a child. That kid learns that those things are very inconvenient. Nobody wants it. And I better just wrap it up in a nice little bow and stuff it down because it's not welcome in any of my relationships. So how does that translate as an adult? They're very avoidant of emotional and physical intimacy. Makes them very uncomfortable. This is very foreign, and I've been taught that it's not okay. So being emotionally vulnerable and going into like deeper emotional conversations and experiences with people is not comfortable. And that also goes with physical intimacy too, right? Because there's two different types of intimacy. There's the emotional and there's the physical. So generally people with avoidant attachment style aren't really comfortable with either one. Then there's the hyper independence part of it. So let's look at adults in the relationship versus at work, how that can sometimes show up. So we all have that person in our life where we think like, man, you've got it all together. You got it all done by yourself. Quote unquote, like boss mom can sometimes go sleigh ride right into that, right? Like
exactly.
You do it all. You're superwoman. You do all the things all the time. Like, I don't know how you do it. All of that is tied into their self-worth, most likely, right? Their ability to be productive and things like that and be independent and not need anyone's help is really important to someone with avoidant attachment. So in the workplace, that's really, it's acknowledged and it's also rewarded, right? They're like, yeah, they're the one that gets everything done. Oh, they're they're on their own over there, but they got it all under control. They don't need anyone's help. They're not, they work better alone than on a team. So those sorts of things can show up at work, but in a relationship, it sort of equates to, I don't need anything. So like, right. I don't need anything from you, So when we get into those emotional conversations, like, what do you need from me? Like, what are your expectations from me as your partner? I don't need anything. I'm fine. and that's really difficult to navigate around because you have to get through to the core of everyone needs to be needed. Like everyone wants to be needed, everyone wants to be wanted, but it's much safer not to be. So breaking down the wall of that defense and learning to be vulnerable is a significant challenge with someone with avoidant or dismissive attachment style.
Mm-hmm. And then that's probably real difficult if you got somebody with anxious attachment, that's the other spouse.
100%. So that creates this pursuer-distancer relationship. I think we visited this before on previous episodes, but there's the pursuer, which would be like the anxious attachment. That's the person that goes, wait, come back here. I want to talk about this right now. Come back. And then there's the avoidant, and he's the one that's like pulling back. He's the distancer. So he keeps pulling back. This creates very common. It creates a double bind, which is a really fancy way of saying you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So the more this person, the anxious person, pursues, the more the distancer withdraws. And so there isn't any of the coming together. There's just this constant chase. So that is a common dynamic that you see in relationships where the person that needs the constant reassurance, the anxious attachment person, and the avoidant attachment person isn't giving them that constant reassurance. So there's this constant chase, and then nobody feels satisfied. The avoidant person feels smothered, while the anxious person feels like they're not sure about the security of their position in their relationship. Mm-hmm. So that is a common dynamic that we see happen.
Interesting. Wow, that's so eye-opening.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about when you zoom out of your relationship. When you come to couples counseling, we diagnose the symptoms, right? You have the symptoms. These are things that my partner is doing that really irritates me. Mm-hmm. And then when you start digging into, well, how does that make you feel? Well, he or she, they're constantly asking me like for reassurance. Do you love me? Are we still good in our relationship? Like those sorts of things. And I just gives me the icks. I don't like it. It mm-hmm. totally turns me off. And then when we start visiting and looking into like attachment and things that happen in childhood, it starts to make sense. And then it doesn't all of a sudden seem like, oh, I'm not a problem. No, you're not a problem. It's what you've developed and what you've learned through no fault of your own. This is how you've learned to cope and how you've learned to relate to people. And when we put it into that sort of context, there's less room for blame, right? It's no longer a conversation of he or she doesn't meet my needs. They never tell me they love me or tell me that I'm pretty or any of these things. Now it's that makes so much sense. Mm-hmm. So now we realize where some of those differences lie. And now I know that when you ask me those questions, it's because maybe you didn't receive that when you were younger. And that's sad.
It is sad.
The avoidant person, the one that seems to be closed off, I understand now. You're avoidant and you're dismissive because like you were taught that was the way to do it mm-hmm. and that your feelings weren't valuable. I can teach you that they are. I can show you that your feelings are valid and they're real and you're loved and worthy in whatever condition that you're in. And that becomes a game changer in relationships.
Mm-hmm. That sounds big. Amy's asking if you can be a mixture of these things. I feel like, yeah.
100%. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. These are just the 3 most common insecure attachment styles. But certainly people can have like a mixture because we're complicated beings, right? And we go through a lot of different things. And, not only is attachment, what we're talking about today, important from childhood, but we also have previous relationships that have also caused trauma in some respects too. So those things have to kind of be combined in there too. So you combine a little bit of attachment, a little bit of trauma from previous relationships, and you can see a little bit of a amalgamation of more than one.
Mm-hmm. All right. Number 3.
So number 3 is disorganized attachment. Disorganized is one of the most challenging attachment styles to work through in a relationship. That's because it does largely boil down to trust. So people who have disorganized attachment have come from a place where the caregivers are not only there, but they are a source to be feared. So we are fearful of those caregivers and they are inconsistent. So we can't have a true bond with them because we never know what's going to happen next. Mm-hmm. We don't know what their response is going to be next. We don't know if it's going to be good, bad, otherwise. So we don't trust it. So we don't trust it, and we are fearful of that. So it becomes really challenging because in adults, we have difficulty trusting people.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can't trust people, sometimes how that shows up is people with disorganized attachment can have a higher propensity of mental health disorders, including a borderline personality disorder, and depression, and also substance use. So if you feel like you can't trust people, you can't trust anybody, it's an incredibly lonely existence, right? So not only could you not trust those caregivers, but now you don't know who to trust. You don't know who in your life that you can trust with your feelings, trust with yourself. There's no security there, and that can be very lonely, hence depression, substance use, and sometimes BPD. So those are some of the things that make it really challenging. The difference between disorganized and avoidant is people with disorganized attachment, they want the relationship. Avoidant and dismissive don't want it. They want to avoid it. They're just, nope, I don't want that. People with disorganized, they want it. They just don't trust it. So they want to have that connection, but they don't trust the other person or their intentions. And sometimes that can lead to a sort of like a self-sabotage situation where they might end a relationship before it's time, or before it's necessary, because I don't think I can trust you anymore, or this is getting to feel too comfortable, too secure. I can't trust it. My spidey senses are tingling. This doesn't feel right. I got to dip. I just got to cut and run here. And so people with disorganized attachment want that relationship, but they're so fearful of it that it makes having one really, really hard. And that's across all relationships, not just romantic ones, because essentially nobody can be trusted. And so that makes it really tough when you're trying to build relationships. That person is consistently waiting for rejection. They're waiting for it. It's not if, it's when. So when you don't trust someone and you feel like you're in a constant state of being at risk for rejection, why would you stick around and see what's going to happen next? You're going to revert back to, well, I was fine by myself because I can trust myself. So I'll just stay by myself. And so that is part of what makes a disorganized attachment so tricky to treat in relationships. It's a tough one.
Yeah, that must be a tough one to kind of pin down.
It is a tough one, because we're talking about trust, right? And so we also have to dig in not only to attachment, we have to dig into what's happened in the relationship or past relationships that may have contributed to a lack of trust. It might not be attachment at all, but it might be that my partner's had 3 affairs since we've been together, and now I don't trust them.
Yeah.
So, or my ex before this partner, cheated on me. And so now I don't trust men, or I don't trust women. I don't trust that their intentions are pure, that they might just be using me for, whatever purpose. And so that's a hard one to pin down, because you have to untangle all of that. You have to see where the attachment in that person lies and what the history has been in the relationship and past relationships. Sometimes it's both, sometimes it's one or the other. Sometimes it's an avoidant attachment style with someone who's been cheated on a bunch of times. So I'm not going to get close to you because, one, I don't feel really comfortable with it. And the last time that I did, I kind of went out of my comfort zone and I tried to have that attachment with someone, but they screwed me over. And so now nobody can be trusted and I'm done here. So that does make it really difficult to untangle sometimes.
Yeah, I can see why.
Yeah.
And now I can see why. And I mean, I've always known this. Well, probably not always, but I've learned this. I understand why it's important to talk about what your partner went through in childhood during couples counseling, because that's kind of what has molded them, right? So I can see why it always goes back to that. And I can also understand the person who doesn't want to dive into that, especially if their background has been, rather hazardous, who wants to really relive that,
Absolutely. Significant trauma, especially significant trauma that's been untreated. That's not exactly, doesn't sound like an easy Sunday morning to go through those experiences and try to figure out if they're related to my current relationship issues. And it's something that I hear a lot of is we don't have to go that deep. Let's just talk about why we can't solve this problem, or why we can't resolve conflict, or why we can't talk, or, any of those things. And, again, as I said before, we do have to visit, We don't have to live there, but if I have a pretty good frame of reference of what your experiences were like and your partner does too, then everything takes on a different lens. Nobody's doing any particular thing necessarily on purpose. It's just what they've learned to do, what they've been conditioned to do. It's served them for a very long time. So now that you're in couples counseling and you're trying to rewire that, that's really scary. Because it's something that has served you. That's a part of you that has protected you, that has served you for a very long time. Whether it's healthy or not and has resulted in healthy relationships or not, it is still a part of you that drives you. And so it needs to be recognized and honored for. I understand why you're here. I understand why you're doing that for me, but I think that there is a better way. And so I'm going to let a different part of myself kind of take charge for a little bit and see if I can have a different type of relationship.
Yeah, totally agree. We have an audience member that mentioned she's always thought it was important to talk about this before getting serious, but would this be a turnoff while still trying to meet? So I think she means like in the honeymoon phase.
My inclination on that is to say, maybe not. Because if someone has the awareness of what their attachment style is, that might suggest that they've either been in therapy before or they're currently in therapy. So they have awareness. I mean, I don't have an exact percentage to represent here, but I would say most of the time, people don't realize that. They don't realize how their attachment styles are linked to how they behave in their relationships. So, almost for me, my first inclination would be to say no. In fact, that emotional awareness might make me more interested, right? Like you're trying to work on yourself. You're recognizing things in yourself that aren't necessarily healthy. And, now I know that when you display this particular behavior, I might inquire a little bit more. I might be a little bit more curious, and know that that's just something that you have defaulted to, your entire life. So I don't necessarily think that would be a deal breaker if that person is aware of it and is actively, in therapy for it or doing things for themselves to try to be aware emotionally and physically of how their behaviors are manifesting.
Well, and my thought too is I get that it's early on is, the important part of the conversation here. But if even an early on partner is unwilling to have a deep conversation like that with you, I don't know, red flag.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Yeah, someone that is not really wanting to have a deeper emotional connection or conversation might not be someone that you would be gravitating towards unless you are someone with an avoidant attachment style. And then that might feel very comfortable, right? Cool. We don't have to talk about that stuff. We're good. I don't have to worry about talking about the scary stuff. I don't have to worry about being vulnerable. This is good stuff.
Let's not even kiss.
It's fine. It's fine. We don't have to talk about that, icky, gross, emotion stuff. We could just, keep it all very surface level. And so someone with avoidant attachment might gravitate towards that. But then that's when I would say, why am I attracted to that?
Yeah.
Where does that come from?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was a whole lot of interesting information. We had one audience member say that they have never heard of the third attachment style that you shared. Are we through the list of attachment styles?
So those are the three of the insecure attachment styles. The last attachment style is secure. And so that is pretty much the antithesis of all of the other insecure styles that we talked about. And what's really interesting about secure attachment styles is some research suggests that only 66% of people have a secure attachment style. So a little over half, not even 3/4 of people have a secure attachment style. So that just goes to show that attachment plays such a huge role in relationships that we may not even be anywhere aware of. And so secure attachment style looks just the way as you might have pictured it. In your childhood, your parents, your caregivers were very emotionally present, were consistent in meeting your needs. And as you've gotten older, you've learned to have those deeper emotional conversations, to be vulnerable, to have those deep connections, to not perceive, criticism or pushback or anything like that as rejection or blame. You're not proactively avoiding intimacy in any way, whether it's emotional or physical. So it's pretty much, like I said, the opposite of all of those other insecure attachment styles. But 66%, if that's a true number, is not a huge number.
Right.
So it's not the most common. So a lot of people struggle with their attachment in relationships.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. We have one more question from an audience member. And you're going to love this one because this is one of our buzzwords. Are avoidant attachments, I'm assuming people or that type of thing, more prone to be narcissist? Now, I know that you've said narcissism is like a super buzzword that we all love to use, but it's actually fairly rare. Am I correct?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, it's the bingo word right now. Yeah. So I don't think there's a clear answer to that. People who are avoidant or dismissive could potentially, have narcissistic personality disorder. But narcissistic personality disorder wouldn't even become aware of their attachment styles anyway, because typically they don't care.
Right.
So it's even rarer for someone with NPD to realize that they're narcissistic and to want to do something about it. That is like a unicorn, even rarer than people just having narcissistic personality disorder. So I would say not necessarily. People with avoidance attachment styles could have narcissism as well. That would be a very, very interesting combination, but you would be hard pressed to get someone with narcissism to come to terms with that or recognize that or even entertain that idea that that's where their attachment style came from. But I will say that narcissism sometimes can show up as a result of abuse. And so they're not too super far off from each other. But with narcissism, there's very rarely an admission that they are doing anything wrong. Mm-hmm. So that's a tough one to try to put two and two together.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Well, that was incredibly informative. And I know that it was helpful to at least the people that we have with us live today. And I'm sure it will continue to be helpful as it lives on our YouTube channel and our podcast channel as well. Is there anything else, Diana, that you wanted to add about that topic?
I'm so glad that we talked about this today because I think it's something that, again, not a lot of people think about in their relationships. And sometimes we can conceptualize our relationships differently if we look at it from an attachment-based lens. And that's really helpful when we're trying to problem solve or trying to diagnose, particular symptoms in the relationship that don't necessarily feel healthy. And so instead of looking at, these are some really annoying things that you do that I don't like, or these are some really annoying things that I do that you don't like, what about attachment? Have we talked about that? Have we taken a look at, our relationships with our own parents growing up? And does that have something to do with it? And being really vulnerable. I think you will learn a lot if you open yourself up to learning about you and your partner's attachment styles.
Totally agree. And it makes so much sense to learn about why your partner does what they do. Because then I feel like, and in my personal situation, you have an easier time. You kind of the guards down, you have an easier time to work through those things and make it a win-win and make that a harmonious relationship. Because again, two different people from sometimes two different corners of the planet are coming together to make something harmonious happen. There's going to be some friction there. There's going to be some learning. There's going to be some bending for sure. So
absolutely.
Thank you so much for that, Diana. How can our audience members get in touch with you if they'd like to?
You can find me at dianaeiseltherapy.com, or you can go to my Facebook or Instagram. It's Diana Eisel Therapy. You can go to my website, click in the top right corner. You can schedule a free 15-minute consultation with me. Otherwise, you can email me and let's get in touch.
Sweet. And if you would like to check out any of our past episodes, Diana and I were just talking before we hopped on the show and we were like, oh my gosh, I think it's been over a year and a half that we have been doing this now,
yes.
Which has been amazing. Thank you so much. Again, I know I always thank you constantly, but I totally love having you with us. I love your knowledge. I love your experience. I love your ability to put it in simple language for our audience members. So thank you again so much for that, Diana.
Well, thank you for having me. I love being here.
Of course. And again, I was going to give you our YouTube handle. Sorry about that, guys. I got all excited about having Diana here month after month for the last over a year and a half. But if you hop on over to our YouTube channel, it is at Mom Nation USA. That is our handle. You can scroll down and you will see Diana and I's lovely faces on the cover of Q&A with the Couples Counselor, Our Love Story. That is the name of the podcast. If you are more of the podcast like audio version type, you prefer that over the video, hop over to your favorite podcast platform, do a quick search for Mom Nation Talk Radio, and there you can connect with our podcast channel, which not only has this awesome show that is going through there each month, but a lot of our awesome shows as well. So you'll be able to connect with us and everything there. We will see you next time, guys.
Bye.